All right, you guys, I am particularly so excited for this episode. And I bet you guys are as well. We have Lindsay Golich with us. She is a senior exercise physio for the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. We're going to dive into all things lactic acid, lactate testing. She's going to break it all down for us. I have so many questions. This is, like I said, it's going to be a learning episode for me as well. So very excited to have you here, Lindsay. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I love talking about this. I love all things sports science. So super excited to dive into this and hopefully, get some even more questions out of it on the back end.
Yeah, we are. I mean, I'm super pumped. I was telling Amanda before you logged on, I was like, I can't wait. Like, I have so many questions. I'm so interested to learn. So this will be really fun. But as our listeners know, I've been doing our two truths and a lie to learn a little bit more also about our guests. So we'll dive into that first. So why don't you go ahead and break those down for us?
Okay, so these are not as sciencey related, but it
Totally
might be
fine.
hard to tell, and you might be just listening. But I have two different colored eyes. So my
Oh,
first two truths and a lie is I'm colorblind.
okay.
The second one is when I was younger, I wanted to be an archaeologist.
Okay.
Still in the sport science world, but not quite athletes.
Yep.
And then I hate swimming in the ocean, even though I love doing triathlon.
Okay. If some of these are true, I am on your level. The archaeologist thing, did you grow up, it was what, Jurassic Park, like part of your
Kind
upbringing?
of like I
Yeah.
think when I was really little, I remember a video, like I don't know, like a VHS tape that
Yeah.
a parent or grandparent gave me. It was all about volcanoes and all these things. And I just thought, this is so cool.
Yeah.
And living in Colorado, there's a lot of different places where there's fossils and footprints and different things just on the Front Range that are
So cool.
historic and national landmarks. And I just thought, this is so cool. I want to learn more about it.
Yeah. That is fascinating. So I feel like maybe you did want to be an archaeologist. So now like guessing. I'm I also don't like swimming in the ocean. I just don't like swimming in somewhere where I can't see the bottom.
Yeah, it's
So I
eerie.
could, yeah, I could resonate with that. I'm gonna go. I can't tell if your eyes are different colored on our Zoom right now. And whether or not that would make one colorblind. I'm not sure. I'm gonna go with that as being the lie. What do you think, Amanda?
I'm gonna go colorblind just because I feel like the other two definitely seem like plausible. I mean, you could be colorblind too. It's usually a thing that happens in men.
Oh, I
I don't know.
didn't. That's an interesting stat. Did not know
Or
that.
I think I might have just made that up. We better
Yeah.
verify.
Awesome. Okay, so don't tell us the answer. We will reveal that at the end. But why don't you take us back a little bit and let us know how you got to where you are and interested in the field of research and athletic performance and at the US Olympic Committee.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so I'm located here in Colorado Springs at the Olympic Training Center, and I'm a sport physiologist. And I got into this world of athletics just at a really young age. My parents are continue to be avid cyclists, triathletes, swimmers, tennis players, skiers, you name it. But I found my way to triathlon through a series called Iron Kids Triathlon, which
Oh,
it's still around today, but not quite in the same, I guess, context that it was in the 80s and 90s. It was really big then. And through that, just starting to do triathlons at a really young age, I got more and more into it, just more and more competitive. And when I was a teenager, I made our U23 national team and got invited to go to the Olympic Training Center in Chula Vista
mm,
for the summer. And I was a coach's selection because I was too young to be officially on the team, but wanted to get involved and see what it meant as I got older. And in the first 2 or 3 days on the ground, they ran us through all this lactate testing, funny enough. So
mm.
we're out on the track running 800, taking lactates. We were in the lab on the bike with the metabolic cart, doing lactate testing in the pool, in the ocean, all these different things. And I remember the physiologist, who is one of my colleagues and still one of my mentors, did all the testing. 2 days later, they sit down with us and they kind of told us everything about ourselves from a performance perspective. And I thought, I've never met this person. And they're telling me everything that my coaches, my parents, everyone's already telling me. And they just looked at it from drops of blood and gas
Wow.
exchange. And I thought, this is so cool. This is exactly what I want to do. So I think I'm a little unique is that I got exposed to it at a pretty young age, was really just enamored by what you could tell by testing and assessments of an athlete. And I stayed on that trajectory from, undergraduate, graduate school to be able to get where I am today. And I wasn't thinking like, I have to be an Olympic sport physiologist at the Olympic Training Center. It's something I've always wanted to do. And I feel like I'm very fortunate to have found this role. But I also coach athletes. I coach endurance athletes. I've been with Carmichael Training Systems, a coaching company for, gosh, almost 20 years, which is crazy. Wow. And I just love sport. I mean, you could put me into some obscure sporting competition and I'd be all in, and I want to learn more about it. So just understanding the body and, how we can make ourselves better physically. I always kind of joke from like the neck down is my role. I know that's not really the case, but just looking at really how to optimize performance with getting the most out of doing the least.
Amazing. Yeah. Most efficiently, right? So, because we're going to try and focus as much of this as we can on lactate testing, but there may be some other components, I'm sure. Can you kind of explain to us what is lactate testing?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think lactate testing is big. I think maybe understanding just what lactate is first before we even do the testing.
Mm-hmm.
And so lactate, it is basically glucose, which is carbohydrates, being broke down into the body. And when glucose or carbohydrates, however you want to think about it, is broken down, it's broken down into pyruvate, which is just another part of the process. Now, that can be then broken down into two different pathways. Pyruvate can create energy. So if anyone is listening to this and they have this visceral feeling of, oh my God, sports science or physiology, and you're starting to sweat, it's okay. That's why there's people like us here to do it for you. And you can Google the quick facts. But, so lactate can create energy. But lactate in the body, we often hear it as lactic acid, and we think, oh, is this a really bad thing? Well, it's a friend and a foe. It can be both, but lactate, as it's broken down, creates this hydrogen ion floating around in the blood that allows the blood to be more acidic. But that's not a bad thing, because then lactate plus pyruvate, or that hydrogen plus pyruvate equal lactate, which then can be a buffer. It can also be fuel or energy, and it also can help with hormone regulation. So it can do a lot of really good things in the body. Obviously, in this context, we're thinking about sport. And so lactate, yes, it is a fuel, and it also can be a detriment to sport or performance, but it's a kind of a double-edged sword, because you need it. You need to figure out where it is, to push the limits, to understand where you physically are, how far you can go. And then we can also, which we'll get to in a little bit, use it as a way to assess your progress or progression, or maybe lack of thereof, depending on what's happening within your training and performance, and maybe the timeline and everything else that's going on.
This is helpful. So you said the lactate molecule plus, did you say hydrogen makes pyruvate?
Yeah, well, so as glucose is broken down, it makes pyruvate. And then pyruvate is paired with this lactate, which creates this hydrogen plus ion, which is the acidic part in your blood. So everyone says, oh, it's really, lactate is acidic. Yes, it is, but it's not acidic in a bad way, because when that acidity is partnered with pyruvate, it can create a buffer, which allows you to make more lactate. So depending on the level of intensity, depends on how much lactate your body is actually producing. So if you're going really low intensities, let's say just walking around, or if you're a runner, you're going at a really slow intensity or running pace. If you're on a bike, should be very conversational. You can sing a song without getting winded. All the things where it's not taxing you, you're producing lactate, but it's in really minimal amounts. On the opposite side, if you're going really, really hard, really intense, maximal sprint, you're going to produce a lot of lactate. And so again, it's a friend and a foe. You need the lactate at low intensities. You can recycle it and create more and more energy. On the top end, you can't clear it quickly, so you do produce a lot of lactic acid. And you can only perform that intensity or pace, power, however you're quantifying it, for so long. And it's really hard to say because if you're going maximal, maybe it's 10 seconds. If you're going almost maximal, maybe it's 5 minutes. It just depends. There's different levels of what your body and your overall fitness can tolerate.
Interesting. And so if someone is doing, taking it back to like your track scenario, right? If they're doing like 100-meter or 400-meter sprint and they get that burn in the legs, or like the legs feeling like they've like maxed out and they're almost not like the not responding point, is that lactic acid building up,
Yeah,
or
it is. Yeah.
it
And
is?
so
Okay.
I think, I mean, I would say almost everyone's experienced it in some
Mhm.
form, right? Just depending on how you do it. And I always say it's kind of that like pump sensation that you feel
Mm.
where your legs would give out maybe before your lungs would, as an
Mhm.
example. So you can go, but you're thinking, I can't climb another stair, or I can't, I can only take 10 more running steps, or I can, push my bike, 15 more feet before I have to change my intensity. And a
Mhm.
little change goes a long way. So that change of intensity for runners, it might be
Mhm.
going from a run to a walk,
Mm.
or a mile type of all-out effort to what you could sustain for 10 miles, right? So your
Mhm.
body can actually recycle it and
Hmm.
go into that electron chain transport system, which again, kind of scary from our like, high school and college days of
Biochem.
education, but
Yeah.
then it gets recycled back into energy and starts the whole process. And it's what's really interesting is that lactate, it is a little predetermined, a little bit genetic as well.
Oh,
Like
interesting. Okay.
I myself, I am very aerobic. I always joke with people, I'm like, I'm like Forrest Gump. I can go out and run all day at the same pace, but you ask me to sprint, I can sprint for like 10 seconds and I'm done. Where on the opposite side, you have someone who's really sprinty. So like a
Mm.
current track athlete, like,
Mm.
well, not even current, but like a Usain Bolt, right? Just
Mhm.
this amazing sprinter. He can tolerate a lot of high levels of lactate, much more
Interesting.
sprinty or anaerobic in nature,
Hmm.
right? But we've kind of gravitated towards those sports or
Mhm.
disciplines. Um, I always remember someone telling me back in the day, saying like, you can almost tell with even like children playing PE that,
Mm.
the ones that can get to the ball the fastest, if everyone's equally coordinated, they're probably more sprinty compared to the
Mm.
kid that can get to the ball the fifth time because everyone
Mhm.
else is tired and they just keep doing it. They're just wearing people down. They're going to be more aerobic.
Yeah. Does that correlate with, it makes me think of the like 23andMe, they send you a report and they say like you're more prone to, or I forget how exactly they word it, but it was something along the lines of like you'd be better off as a sprinter and you'd be better off as a something like more aerobic based training or something like that. Does the, and I'm assuming they're basing that genetic or feedback based off of was it muscle fiber type maybe?
Yeah, yeah. And so I'm not quite familiar exactly with the 23andMe, how they
Okay.
go through it. But
Yeah.
yes, so we do figure out from muscle fiber typing.
Mm.
And, lactate threshold can give us an insight. Obviously, it's not going to tell us the whole thing of
Mm.
your physiological, what you can be great at. It doesn't mean that you can be good at things. You can be good at everything, but maybe what you can be great at.
Mm.
And again, I think it gives you insight or how you can train yourself to optimize your physiological, ability, and then what you have to do to change differently to work on your weaknesses as an athlete.
Hmm.
And I think those things are important. And I often say that when we're doing lactate testing or lactate threshold testing here, is it just gives me an insight into the physiology.
Hmm.
So what's kind of interesting is that, I see a lot of different sports and different athletes come through, is that we can have, cyclists that might have peak lactates, in the low teens or single digits.
Okay.
And then we also have cyclists, maybe like a BMX athlete
Mm.
or a freestyle BMX athlete, where it's really explosive and very intense for short periods of time. Those peak lactates are going to be very different. So
Mm.
we might have more of an endurance all around road cyclist. Their peak lactates could be 12 or 13, where some of our BMX athletes, their peak lactates are in the 20s.
Mm.
So, and again, you've kind of gravitated towards those sports. And I'm a little bit biased because at the Olympic level, we're looking at the best of the best.
Right.
So it's already been some natural selection of just performances.
Hmm.
But here you can really see kind of just the dichotomy of, power and explosive sports to more aerobic and type of endurance sports as well.
Interesting. And so to have that example, the BMX athlete peaking in the 20s, and then the endurance, say, cyclist peaking in like the low teens, maybe even single digits. Does that mean that one of those athletes is better at clearing or more efficient at clearing lactate than the other?
Not necessarily. So I think how you clear it really comes back to the coaching and the training.
Mm.
So it's more what you can do with what you're given. So
Mhm.
I think the thing is that we can have really endurance or really aerobic cyclists that have peak lactates in the 20s that race on the
Mhm.
road, and we also might have some that are in the single digits or maybe like 10, 11, 12. So there's a big difference there, but it's more of understanding how your body responds to efforts or
Mhm.
intensities, I would think, and
Mhm.
then how you can maximize your own ability. So
Mhm.
cycling's a little bit different because it's not always just a pure power unless you're time trialing. In a group
Mhm.
it's like chance and understanding the field and dynamics of
Mhm.
the race. So you could be really aerobic and still be in the final sprint. But if
Okay.
you're in the final sprint against someone who's a sprinter, maybe you have to go long compared
Mm.
to leaving it to the last minute. So you're
Mm.
trying to maximize what your physiology or your benefits are. And the same thing could be for a 10K runner. We see, at the Olympics or these, track and field events, is that someone who might be a little bit more sprinty can, have an extra gear as they come around that third bend into the final 100, 150 meters, where someone who's more aerobic, they kind of have to go for it with 2 to 3 or 400 meters to go. And they kind of try to get out front and just hold on for dear life for someone coming around the end. So again, there's a lot of different ways you can think about it. And both athletes are amazing and both can do things, but it's just understanding maybe how you can optimize the physiological traits that are more characteristic to you as an individual.
Interesting. And so if we have a single athlete, I'll use a cyclist, endurance cyclist, because that's probably a large amount, or endurance runner, large amount of our listeners probably. If they do a lactate test and they find out they're in the low teens, and then they're working on improving their performance, what would they see their lactate level then do? Is their lactate level increasing, meaning they can tolerate more lactate in the muscle, or is the lactate level coming down because they're clearing it better, and that then determines that they're more
Yeah,
fit?
it's a great question. And unfortunately, it's just not so black and white. I would say it
Mm.
just all depends on what you're trying to focus on. So if
Okay.
let's say we have someone and their peak lactate is 13,
Mm-hmm.
they could work on, doing more short, explosive, maximal anaerobic type of sprints.
Mm-hmm.
Their peak lactate may not change a whole lot,
Mm.
but it's then maybe how quickly they can clear it. So,
Okay.
and that then becomes from two different ways to do it.
Mm-hmm.
We have, like this talk about really polarized training where you're doing really low levels training, really low levels of
Mm.
intensity, really high intensity levels for short periods of time. That can help to clear lactate. And clearing it's different for everybody, but also doing low intensity also may clear the lactate more
Mm.
quickly. Again, it just depends on, are you trying to do it for one maximal sprint, or do you know there's going to be 4 or 5 maximal sprints throughout the race or
Mm.
event or whatever you're trying to train? And that helps to give some guidance. Now,
Interesting.
to have just clear lactate, how quickly and efficiently you can do it, really the first thing that you have to do is measure it to see
Mm.
where you currently are. So you can't just make assumptions of I feel good or I feel bad. So lucky enough, I have our US rowing national team here, and on Thursday we're running all the athletes. We've got about 36 athletes
Wow.
through lactate testing, and we have a step test that we're running everybody through. And we take lactates at the end of each stage. And at the very end, we'll measure what their peak lactate is and how quickly it begins to come back down. Now,
Oh, okay.
some athletes, their lactate can stay elevated for longer periods of time. Other athletes,
Mm.
it comes down more quickly.
Mm.
And that gives us a little bit insight to how they're responding to the current training that is being prescribed or how they're executing it as well.
Hmm.
And then if there's anything that maybe the coach needs to adjust for or to consider. And then, there's a whole other plethora. It could be nutrition, hydration related, supplement related. There's like a million different things that you can focus on.
Yeah.
But I think the most important thing is you have to actually measure it
Mm-hmm.
in order to know what what your lactate is and what your personal levels are.
Mm-hmm.
Because you and your, let's say, training partner, you can both do the same power on the bike, or you can run a marathon at the same time or within minutes, but how you individually respond to that are two very different ways. So you actually have to measure it to understand where you are when what you're doing.
Interesting. Okay. And oh my goodness, so many questions, Lindsay. So, okay, so it sounds like there's not a set point of if you're above 16 on a lactate level, performance is going to be a real struggle. It's very individual, it sounds like. Are are you comparing this or pairing this with, I know you mentioned you do some gas exchange work as well, or even RPE or heart rate zones. Do any of these connect together with lactate testing and how we use that information?
Yeah, I think yes, they do. And I think maybe just kind of taking a step back is figuring out like, how do we measure lactate? What are the ways that we can do it? So we can do it in a laboratory setting. In a laboratory, we can use as a loose term here. We've got this amazing lab, but a lab could be in your home garage. It could be on your home treadmill, right? That's your lab space or wherever it might be. Or you can do it out in the field, so out in the open road. We have lactate monitors. The ones that we use here, we use a Lactate Plus. We're not tied into anything specific. They're just cost effective, easy to get. That's kind of always our criteria because, as an example, I have 36 athletes I'm testing on Thursday, and that's a lot of lactate strips and a lot of meters, and we just need a lot of supplies, and we've got to make sure we have it here. And these strips, basically you take a finger prick of blood or something from the ear. It takes 5 microliters, which is actually a really teeny tiny amount of blood. It's doesn't hurt much. It's just kind of one of those retractable lancets. And there's these test strips and they measure your blood and they measure the lactate specifically. And it only takes about 15 to 30 seconds to process depending on what device you have. There are some other devices out there that look at in your sweat, some of the wearable technologies, as well as saliva. That you might spit into a tube or kind of suck on a gauze pad and put it into a tube. All of those work well. I have the most confidence right now in the blood systems, but there are wearable technologies that if it works for you and you're getting consistent results, I think that's great. And to be honest, all these systems are similar price point. You can get yourself up and running probably for about like $500 or less for testing and things. So it's, if you're going to charge people, when you can, recoup your costs pretty quickly if you're testing yourself and you're kind of in it for the long haul compared to some of the other products out there. It's comparable to shoes and obviously a lot less expensive than a bike.
Yeah.
But so these methods, so we use that technology for lactate. For in the lab setting, we do a step test is one way to do it, meaning that we'll do various stages and every stage you increase intensity. And at a minimum, you want to have at least 5 stages of collecting data. On the maximum, you really don't need more than 10 stages. And there's kind of the sweet spot is that you need enough stages because you're looking at what each lactate, how your body's responding at each workload. So let's say for a bike example, we're starting at 100 watts and every stage we increase by 25 watts. So we go 100, 125, 150, so on and so on. Is that we should see an increase of lactate as you go up in intensity. And the same thing would be if you're running, your running paces go up, is that you need to be able to see a point where you start producing more lactate than you can clear. And if we only have 3 or 4 stages, it's hard to identify that. If we have 10 or more stages, there's a lot of fatigue because now the test is so long that you might not be getting a clear lactate. So typically the sweet spot is about 7 stages, but there's always a little buffer depending on, athletes and workloads. Now in the open field, it might just be more of like a time trial effort. You could do something where it's progressive, increases and running speeds around a track. Where you're doing, half-mile repeats or mile repeats or 1K repeats, depending on how fast or slow you are, and you're progressively getting faster. You could do the same thing on a bike. Often on the bike, we're just doing, a hill climb or a 20-minute or a 30-minute time trial effort and taking lactates, possibly during it or after, depending on your comfort and level of expertise. And again, these ways give us insight to what's happening in a lab setting in a controlled environment. And then we can also see what's happening in the real world and, how our prescription or assessments are between the two. And I think that's important to just understand that process as we go through just, how we're collecting it, why we're collecting it as well. I know you mentioned, like, can we layer on other things like heart rate and metabolic, so the VO2? Yes, and we often can. Again, it's just resource dependent. So RPE, rate of perceived exertion, is a great one. It's super easy to use. There's a thing called the Borg scale. It's on an RPE of 6 to 20. That's what we often use in research methods. And it seems kind of a weird number for a lot of people, but 20 is a maximal effort and 6 means you're just, getting off the couch. But we often find that when people or athletes are between 14 to 16, when they're saying that as their RPE, that often correlates with the lactate threshold 2 or ventilation threshold 2 on that scale. If you're using a scale of 1 to 10 and 10 being maximal, it obviously can kind of happen a similar percentage right around that 7 to 8 is typically what we see, but it doesn't always correlate exactly the same with everybody. And then when we're using metabolic or gas exchange, we can see there's hopefully a crossover for that RER, the respiratory exchange ratio of carbohydrates and fats that we're looking at. And we often see when we make that transition, when we're using both as a fuel source to only carbohydrates as a fuel source, that number goes to 1.0 and higher. And that often correlates with a lactate threshold. And I say often, with an example here with our really aerobic endurance type of athletes that do a lot of big volume training, like rowers or really ultra endurance runners or cyclists who are doing big miles, is that they may not hit 1.0 as soon as the most or general population. So for them, that crossover, we might see at 0.95 or 0.90. Again, there's some other physiological traits that are happening that and training perspectives that we have to take into account. But when we pair those two, the metabolic and the lactate, often they help to confirm or validate each other that there's a break point. And that break point stands for OBLA, which is the onset of blood lactate accumulation. And it's just the point, again, where you're producing more lactate than you can clear. And often that number is then corresponding with heart rate, power, or pacing, then to help with training prescriptions for training ranges and training zones for coaches and you as an individual to figure out where you need to train and how you can get better.
Okay. So someone goes and does their first ever lactate test and they maybe maybe you have an example scenario that you could give us, Lindsay. I'm thinking like if a runner they're maxing out at their 20 on the Borg scale is, I don't know, like a 7-minute mile and they're at their lactate threshold, then a coach would take that information and adjust their programming to, if they're wanting to improve their mile time, for example, they would use that data to do that, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I always think, the goal of testing for myself as a physiologist in lactate threshold and metabolic testing is that if we've done previous testing or we have a lot of information, meaning power, pacing, heart rate that we're looking at, it should validate our current training ranges and prescriptions. Now, if you're new to this, it helps to prescribe training intensities based upon heart rate, the lactate, the VO2, if you're incorporating it, RPE, all the different metrics. Now, the goal is that over time for all of us is that we want to get faster, right? That's why we're doing all this. That's the end goal. So I always say we want to assess where we are. And then we want to do another assessment later to see changes in performance. So let's say we'll use the rowers as the example. They have all done the step test in December. So we're doing our second test here about 6 to 7 weeks later. So in December, this group of athletes was coming off their off season. So it was to help to reestablish training ranges really for the next 6 to 7 weeks of training. So we don't want to take training ranges that we're using when you're in peak performance. We want to take training ranges or see where you are now so we can do the right type of training prescription. Now, when we hopefully test on Thursday, we'll see improvements and then we can reevaluate, meaning that what we would actually see is that lactate levels at the lower intensities because of the training they've done should be lower. So meaning at, at stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, that if we graph them out, the December line would be a little bit higher across the board than I guess the January line, if you will. And so we can see that there's an improvement in their aerobic conditioning. Now, let's say we don't see that improvement, that's okay too. We then either have to figure out, was there sickness, injury, or illness going on, or was a training prescription not right for that athlete? Which all of these things are good things, because you're hopefully confirming the next best steps to do just to keep optimizing performance. And then I think what we do moving forward from that too is that we retest again. Now, we don't need to retest every 4 to 6 or 8 weeks. I feel like some people love to do that, but it can be a lot for others. Is that I honestly think, 2 times a year is great, where you get yourself at the base season, and as you're moving into more peak fitness, doesn't have to be right at peak fitness, but as you're making that transition, where you see a noticeable change in your performance or ability. And if you have time for a third, then you'd want to do it right around your peak fitness, and you can actually see what's happening to you in your training program, how you're responding to it throughout the course of a season.
Okay. And out of curiosity, just from your observation, thinking about how kind of generally women oxidize more fats than men at the same intensity, do you see differences between lactate thresholds between men and women?
Yeah, interesting. I have not seen that.
Okay.
But I don't know enough. If someone is really focusing on like female hormones and the response to blood lactates, they may see something. But I would say I would have to really take a deeper dive into our numbers to see if there's any changes like that.
Yeah.
But I have both men and women that have low lactates and high lactates. The one thing that we often see might be more in just other blood work, but not regarding just the lactate perspective of it, of just maybe other areas of deficiencies that we have to focus more on for certain populations. But that's like a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, save that for the second episode. And then with regards to diet and preparation to their testing, if the lactate is a byproduct of glycogen being utilized or broken down, if someone was following like a high-fat keto diet prior, would we expect to see a lower, higher, earlier lactate threshold ceiling in those?
I think we would. Now, I would say a lot of the athletes I work with, we don't have that as a nutritional recommendation for the endurance population I'm working with. So I don't often see it. I would say we've got 1 out of every 50 athletes that comes through maybe with those nutritional like not backgrounds, but that's what their nutritional intake is. We do see things happen similar. I guess I would say at lower intensities, we do see a lower, not so much lactate, but from a VO2 and metabolic perspective, some lower values of how you're metabolizing carbohydrates and fats. But even someone who's only consuming fats and carbohydrates and or fats and proteins and not so many carbohydrates, will still have a crossover. It just depends on where. It might be closer to their true maximal effort rather than at a threshold level, but I would say we still have an athlete crossover. And then typically if we see an athlete crossover closer to their max or really early on, those are areas that we then sit down with their coaches and say, hey, is this what you're trying to achieve? And if not, then let's put a plan on, maybe how we can change. Maybe it's nutritional, or maybe it is performance and training oriented. Again, it just depends on the population and the group that you're working with.
And so with your rowers, for example, the initial testing, wanting to improve, you're saying like their aerobic conditioning, getting that initial lactate data, I'm not sure if you do the programming or how you suggest, or if you suggest that to the coaches. So maybe if you don't have an answer, no worries, but what would that look like? Or what would one suggest from a training perspective, if they're trying to move that lactate needle in rowers?
Yeah. So again, I mean, we're a little bit different how we're looking at things, right? At the Olympic level, is that And this season in 2024, it's even more different than maybe a previous year, because as we go into an Olympic year, we know
Right.
we want our athletes to be peaked and ready by July, because that's the
Mhm.
Olympics. But we also have to get the right team athletes named to the team, and not we, but the athletes want to perform at that level. So there's timing of selections and different things. So
Mm.
ultimately, the goal of the winter training for this group of athletes is just to improve their aerobic condition. So we're building a bigger foundation or bigger capacity for them to tolerate more work, or to be able to tolerate more intensity, or to be able to recover more quickly from the intervals. All three of those things apply. And that's ultimately been the goal over the last 6 weeks, and will continue to be the goal over the next couple months, as more intensity is layered in.
Okay.
Uniquely, rowing is at altitude here in Colorado Springs, and they've been here for 3 weeks. So we're doing an altitude camp.
Nice.
And as we come to altitude, we've also decreased the type of intensity, because we don't want to overload them as they then transition back to sea level for much more quality training. And there's some selections and things that will be happening in the next couple months for this group of athletes. So there's a whole process that we've been going through, is that there's been a big base training prior to coming to altitude, a lot of base training at altitude. And then as this group transitions back into more intense sea level type of training, which is a little unique for maybe the average listener, but pretty common at the Olympic level for athletes to come to altitude for periods of time.
That's awesome. And talking about altitude, would one have a different lactate production result or peak lactate level at altitude than they did at sea level?
Yeah, so their peak lactates could be different and same as lactate values.
Mhm.
Uniquely here, we have a massive room where we do all our testing, and we bring the room down to sea level, and
That's
we do
right.
all our
Yeah.
testing. So it mimics that type of testing. We did our metabolic testing within the first 2 days of everyone coming to get our VO2 values. And then during the third and final week, we'll do our lactate testing as we move forward. But yes, if you were to come right to altitude, there are changes physiologically that what happens. And typically what happens is that you're suppressed your ability the first couple of weeks to perform the same amount of work you would be doing at sea level. Perceived effort is higher, heart rate is higher. So you have to time your testing appropriately if you're going to altitude, especially if you don't have some of the equipment that we have here, or facilities that we have here, which again are pretty unique. So it is something to keep in mind. But again, I think that is also why we do our testing at sea level. We've come here, we'll do our testing at altitude. They're going to do lots more testing, this group of athletes, between now and August, of various levels, just for confirmation. And again, just fine tuning their individual training plans and recovery plans too on the back end.
Interesting. And so kind of talking about now these, I know we talked a little bit about this in our earlier, the supplements out there that claim lactic acid buffering and that kind of stuff. And then testing with these devices. I think of sodium bicarb, beta alanine, long-term regular use. What does that tell us? What would we expect, or can we see that with these testing strips?
Yeah, I think that's great. So there's a lot of supplements out there that they can claim to lower lactate acid values or lactate improvement. But really, from a research perspective, and you nailed it, is that I would say there's two that I would recommend. And if you go to the AIS, which is the Australian Institute of Sports, they have these supplements that are grouped in group A, B, and C. And A is kind of the gold standard, where we know they're the most effective. And sodium bicarbonate and beta alanine are both in that, top tier grouping. I'd say for those that don't know, sodium bicarbonate, another term or use of it is baking soda. So we don't want to just consume baking soda. There's better products out there, but basically that's what it is, something that's very basic. And really this allows for higher levels of lactate buildup in the body, whereas beta alanine, it delays the accumulation of lactate. So it doesn't change it, but hopefully it can delay it by seconds. Or again, we're not talking minutes of time, but by seconds of time by chronic use. So one is a chronic supplement, beta alanine, and you're taking it for long periods of time. And sodium is an acute, that you're taking it day of, hours prior to competition. They work similarly, but a little bit different context just in the body. When we're just looking at lactate from a lactate testing strip, those lactate testing strips may not and most likely won't be sensitive enough to identify the changes or the shifts in lactate. And the main reason for that is that when we take sodium bicarbonate, again, it's allowing for higher levels of lactate. So you might be able to do, let's say if you're running a 400-meter run interval faster, your lactate levels should get higher. But we would also want to have a way to measure the bicarbonate in the system to make sure that it's actually there and being utilized, or it's being available to be utilized. So there's other devices out there. Those become much more costly to invest in. They typically start at like $3,000 to $4,000 to $5,000, and cartridges are, $25 a cartridge. So it's a costly endeavor compared just to lactate. Now, if you're consuming beta alanine, a lactate monitor won't be sensitive enough to assess changes or the delay in lactate buildup. And again, the same thing with the beta alanine is that you're going to produce a similar amount of peak lactate, but hopefully it just delays the onset by seconds, which, seconds at any level, it could be the difference between first and fourth, or making the finals and not making the finals. So every second counts, but one is they kind of act a little bit differently with the same goal in mind, I suppose.
Yeah. Interesting. And I would imagine too, with the lactate testing, if the beta alanine is just adjusting things maybe by seconds, you would have to like prick the ear and get that blood sample like at the exact right time, right? Or
Yeah, I
similar
would think
time to
so.
prior.
And yeah, I think just the accuracy of the equipment might not be sensitive enough to assess it with the beta alanine.
Yeah.
But I would say with a supplement like beta alanine, it is a well-versed supplement in performance. There's also not a lot of adverse effects, negative, for like toxicities and different things. Certain athletes, they do feel different side effects of it, just like tingling sensations and things. But it's relatively safe. And same with sodium bicarbonate. It's pretty safe. If you consume it incorrectly, it could have some major GI issues, but they're pretty acute. And so the second it hits you, it should be out quickly as well.
Yeah.
But again, with the sodium bicarbonate, it is more of an acute take consumption. So day of, it's not a chronic unless there's other medical underlying conditions, but that is for the medical world to assess, not maybe so much in this realm.
Yeah. And so you're saying if someone were to do a sodium bicarb supplement prior to a, I don't know, an hour bike race or something of that nature, they would, in a tested lactate, they would see slightly higher lactate levels than they had seen in their peak testing.
Yeah, exactly. So we use for sodium bicarbonate, we use this device called an iStat machine. And so it takes blood lactate or blood values from your fingers as well. It takes a bit more than just 5 millimoles, but it then can look at different other, I guess, products in the blood, byproducts in the blood that can then assess what those bicarbonate buildups are. And so by taking the sodium bicarbonate, you're kind of creating a very basic system in your body. So as you produce the lactic acid, which is acidic, that your body can tolerate more amounts of that. And hopefully that allows you to either go the same, your current maximal speed, you can do it for longer, or maybe you can reach new heights and go a little bit faster than you ever did before. And again, it's going to be dependent. But I would say there are some GI, concerns that you have to be cautious of. If you're interested in using this, go to the AIS website, Australian Institute of Sport. They have amazing infographics of what you should be taking, how you can take it. You don't need devices to measure it, but it is a trial and error. Don't save it for race day. Try it in training, different things like that. And again, you'll see if it's something that works for you as an athlete. For really endurance athletes, it's not a great supplement. So it's acute. We take it, it's in your system really quickly. It also exits your system really quickly. So the half-life of it's pretty quick. So really, if you're doing anything over an hour and you're only doing an acute loading of it, like a quick, like a pill or a powder form of it, it's going to really work for a finite period of time. I know there's all these amazing gels. Morton has these different things. There's a lot of good research that's kind of saying like where you're loading throughout an event is showing to be more beneficial and helpful. But again, you need to try it, make sure it sits in your stomach well, and how you're pairing it with all your other nutrition and hydration, and to make sure that you're not getting, the adverse effects of just what it can cause, a lot of gassiness and bloatiness and different things.
Yes. And but I don't think we talked fully about this at the very beginning, which maybe we should have mentioned it, but what are the benefits? Why would one want to utilize something like lactate testing?
Yeah. I think with lactate testing, it creates an objective measurement of where your current fitness is at varying levels of intensity. And so it's not just looking at your ventilation, if again, not saying that you have a metabolic heart, but just, how you're talking. It's not looking at your respiration or your perception of it on that scale of 1 to 10 or 6 to 20. It's also not relying on heart rate. So heart rate, can be impacted by injury, illness, travel, fatigue. It's really very objective measurement. So you're giving yourself a quantifiable data point that can measure your change in fitness over time. And again, like I said, it might be a change for the better, or it might be stagnant, or it might be decreasing, and not one is better than the other. It should just then provide a roadmap of what you need to be doing next to see changes or improvements.
Awesome. And I do want to be mindful of your time. We have a couple listener questions, and then of course we have to reveal your two truths and a lie. So I will fire off with some listener questions. If you don't have the answer, no worries. First one we have here is, can lactate testing tell you if you are overtraining?
Yeah, I think lactate testing can't be the only marker to tell you if you're overtraining, but it can be one cog in the total chain. And an example of that is that if you're on a bike and you're trying to push 200 watts, and you can push 200 watts, but heart rate is suppressed or lactate values are elevated, because it means that you just can't hit that intensity in your body. You're actually working harder to push that 200 watts than you were when you're in a normally trained state. It can be one indication of it. Now, we have to be careful with overtraining to just be quick to say that's the issue, because there's a lot of factors. You would want kind of multiple rounds of some type of testing or assessments of nutrition, sleep, recovery to go into it. But I think it can give you insight or validate what you might be feeling, then to move on to kind of the next check box to see if that's really what is impacting your performance.
Awesome. Okay, next question. Have you heard of lactate clearance workouts, and do they work?
Yeah. So I don't know exactly what a lactate clearance workout is. I feel like all of training, the entire goal of whether it's aerobic training or intensity, is to work on improving lactate clearance. So if you're a coach or your coach is prescribing lactate clearance workouts, I 100% believe that's what they're doing and is prescribing. But again, it just depends on the context. So lactate clearance can mean that you're doing like 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, maximal effort. So you're producing a lot of lactate and you're getting your body used to producing the lactate and clearing it. It could also be a lot of this zone 2 training where you're building the foundation. So again, I think it just depends on the context of how it's being communicated and what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting. And then how do you get rid of lactic acid buildup, or should you?
Yeah. Lactic acid buildup, like I said early on, it's a friend and a foe. Like you need it because you have to push yourself to those intensities to get better as an athlete. You need your body to figure out how to clear it and how to tolerate it. So I think that's great. Foe is that not every session can be hard and just where you're redlining it all the time. At some point, something will have to give.
Yes.
So I think, I don't know if I answered the question, but it's both. I think you need it, but you got to be cautious, or have a periodization, a training plan that helps you, understand what your levels of intensity should be, day in and day out.
That makes sense. And then let's see, last question was, are there specific things you can do while training for a marathon or bike race that can help with your lactate threshold?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the easy answer is yes. Again, I think the way I always think about it is whatever your event is, I like to take that date and work backwards and figure out how much time you have to train, whether it's hopefully more than, 12 weeks for a marathon, unless you're, readily or consistently doing them, but you're giving yourself a big period of time. I think all of training, as I mentioned, you're trying to improve your lactate. You're trying to improve your lactate threshold. A really current school of thought right now is a zone 2 training. That is just, it's a hot topic of how to do it. I think it really works in zone 2 training. For those that don't know, it's just low intensity type of training, a lot of aerobic or endurance type of training where it's a lot of big volume, a lot of hours, that you're accumulating this foundation to be able to do more. And I think that works. But if you're time crunched, or your time crunch meaning hours per week, or time crunched into your event, that may or may not be the right type of training for your lactate threshold. If you have a lot of time, I think it works great.
Right.
And a lot of time might be months or a couple years, depending on what your goal is. And if you're more time crunched, I think doing more what we always call those like lactate threshold type of workouts where, you're, at your race pace goal or just slightly below it or above it, depending on the duration of intensities, where you're accumulating more time there. That really has been effective in showing that can work. If you're more on a time crunch training plan, again, hours per week, or even just duration of time to get ready for an event.
Cool. Very helpful. Okay. I want to be so mindful of your time because we're crunching on the hour, but it's such a good podcast episode already. Okay. So I'll finish it up with your 2 truths and a lie. So you had said that you have 2 different colored eyes and are colorblind, that you wanted to be an archaeologist when you were young, and that you hate swimming in the ocean. Amanda and I thought the colorblind thing was the lie. Were we right?
You're right.
Oh, wow. Okay, great.
Yeah, I do have 2 different colored eyes, but I'm not colorblind.
Oh, cool. That's awesome.
Yeah, I always wanted to be an archaeologist. I love science. I'm glad I can still be in the science world, and obviously a different perspective of it.
Yes.
And I love swimming. I love playing in the ocean, but I'm not a fan of like swimming far out there. Just my mind just starts going to all the places you can't see.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
I'm with you 100%. If I can't see the bottom or it's murky water, I am not in there. Amazing. Okay. And then I did have one final question. Well, 2 final questions because we want to share with people where they can find you and follow you. But I was just curious, where do you think the future of lactate testing and or research in that area is going, or do we need more research, do you think, in certain areas to get more information?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that we're doing lactate testing isn't really changing that much in the immediate future, meaning there's step testing, there's platforms out there that can guide you through things. But I think how we assess it is what's truly changing. So with more of the wearable technologies of taking it from your saliva or looking at it in your sweat while it's looking at hydration and other factors, I really think that's giving more insight to what the lactate means. And I think those are areas, just understanding what's happening at multiple levels of hydration, of lactate, of, electrolyte loss, all those different things that these technologies are offering gives more insight on the individual level. And I think that for sure, I mean, it is the future. It's happening now. These products, there's so many of them, but they're getting better and better. And how they're providing information is really helpful. I think, with lactate, it's easy to assess. Again, it's not that costly in the grand scheme of things of sport, is that as a person, you can test lactate with just about anything. I think that's kind of the interesting tool of it, that you can try different nutrition strategies. You can try different training strategies. And I think that's where I would just start at that. If you're interested in looking at your personal lactate, purchase a meter online, get your supplies, and just start seeing, where you are as an individual, or if you're a coach, start taking that with your athletes and seeing what you can see if it validates what you already know. And if it doesn't, hopefully it gives you more insight to something else.
Amazing. Awesome. All right. Where can people find you, follow you, all of that fun stuff?
Yeah, I am on social media. I don't post as often as I should. I need to get better. It might be one of my New Year's resolutions. I don't know if I've been so successful at it this year, but I have an X handle on Instagram it's at sportsci Lindsay. And yeah, I hope you guys can follow me. There's all sorts of different things out there. And just excited to help learn and spread the word of lactate threshold knowledge and just training in general.
Yeah, amazing. Well, we feel so lucky to have you and all this information. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.